just want to welcome you all to this event, to the Center on Global Energy Policy, to our events here at Climate Week. And it's a great honor to welcome you here for today's discussion on building common ground on climate and trade, which we are co-hosting with the government of Brazil. The Center on Global Energy Policy is the largest energy think tank in the U.S., tries to engage in evidence-based research to help inform today's most pressing energy and climate issues, be a resource to policymakers, to leaders in the private sector and civil society. And part of that is convening high-level conversations with leaders like the one we're honored to have today. Climate and energy and trade is exactly the sort of issue that is in need of dialogue and better understanding. We're seeing almost real time the growing friction at the intersection of the two. But the climate trade nexus also, I think, holds enormous promise, which is why we started a whole program on trade and the clean energy transition not long ago. With the right approaches, we can not only strengthen climate ambition through this nexus, but also help countries meet their vital economic and development needs. We've seen the rise of green industrial policies, subsidies, carbon border adjustments. They're all reshaping the trade landscape. These instruments have a lot of potential. They can lower costs, speed the deployment of clean energy technologies, but they certainly come with risks. And we're seeing some of those globally as well, risks of friction, fragmentation that are feeding already forces of tension around the world, great power competition, rivalry, geoeconomic fragmentation, and potential conflict. And for many countries, particularly across the global south, there's deep concern about being left further behind as this work proceeds. So what we need now more than ever is this sort of dialogue, spaces where governments and stakeholders can speak candidly, break down issues, learn from one another, and begin to hopefully chart a progressive and promising path forward. This is the need that drove the Center on Global Energy Policy and our partners at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, its Institute of Global Politics, last year at Climate Week to launch our international dialogue on climate and trade. And our Elliot Diringer and Trevor Sutton, who lead a lot of that work, are here today and just been a phenomenal part of our team. Over the past year in workshops in Brazil, Singapore, South Africa, the dialogues brought together participants from 22 governments alongside experts from academia, business, and civil society. And these discussions gave participants a chance to collectively explore the challenges and the opportunities at that intersection of climate, energy, and trade. We'll publish insights from that soon. I want to also thank the generous support from the BMW Foundation to do that work. We'll be carrying this dialogue forward over the coming year. And the government of Brazil has been deeply engaged in this work since the very start. And I hope to some extent our dialogue helped inspire a little bit of the bold initiative that our honored guest is here to tell you about. Like our dialogue, the Integrated Forum on Climate and Trade that Brazil will launch at COP30 in Belém will aim to build bridges between climate and trade, between North and South, so that working together, countries will be better able to achieve both their climate and their economic objectives and their energy security objectives. Today's event's an opportunity to hear directly from a broad range of countries about how they see the challenges and the opportunities ahead as we seek to better align our climate and our trade agendas. So to begin the program, I'm quite honored to introduce the Honorable André Corrêa do Lago, the incoming president of COP30. Known to all of you here, Ambassador do Lago has been at the heart of Brazil's climate and sustainable development diplomacy for more than 20 years, has served as Brazil's chief negotiator for climate in the Rio 20 conference, represented his country as ambassador to Japan and India, serves today as Vice Minister for Climate, Energy, and Environment at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in what is no doubt an exceptionally busy week of Climate Week and the UN General Assembly, we're really honored that you made time to be with us here today, and I'd like to welcome you to the lectern for a few remarks, and then we'll have a brief conversation on stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank you and I thank the University of Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy, not only for organizing this event, but also the dialogues that you organized that inspired very much the initiative that last week we launched in Geneva at WTO. As some of you know, we were there to launch the Integrated Forum on Climate Change and Trade at WTO. And as you heard my curriculum, which is always worrying to see that someone can be working with climate change for more than 20 years, it's really frightening. But I think I have a certain experience to know how in our negotiations of climate change, every time the word trade appears, no, we only talk about trade at WTO. And at WTO, when the word climate appears, no, we only talk about climate at UNFCCC. So we thought that creating that forum in which we can try to create a bridge to go ahead is very important. And the reason, the critical reason for that is urgency. If we believe in science, which is nowadays something that is not so obvious, but let's say if we believe in science, we know we have very few years to do the right things. So if we have few years, I mean, it's less and less important to be right and more important to do the things that are necessary. So this is one of the reasons why at COP30, we're giving so much attention to the action agenda, and we structured the action agenda based on what was already agreed, because sometimes the action agenda is used by some countries to try to smuggle some themes into the negotiations. Ambassador Wael from Egypt knows that very well. We work very well together. And this is not something that I think that is the right reason for the action agenda. I think that the action agenda has to be about action. So we have to take what we already have agreed, and then let's work on what, with the other stakeholders that are essential, because, as we all know, in the negotiations, only the states could negotiate. So at the moment of implementation, we have to call the other actors, subnational governments. We have to ask the private sector, academia, think tanks, civil society in general, to work together to implement what the states have agreed. So I believe that this is what is driving us at COP30 to try to have a COP that can really be called an implementation COP. Now, there are many implementation COPs. There were many already. But we have the advantage that we basically closed the rule book that we agreed to negotiate under the Paris Accord. So this is a moment that we had the GST, the Global Stock Take, 2 years ago. And last year in Baku, we closed two of the things that we needed still to do, which was Article 6 and the NCQG, which had a result that is still highly debated today. But the fact is that from a formal point of view, we have advanced, and that's why we can be an implementation COP, and not just by desire, but thanks to the work of the negotiators. So the negotiators did their job, and we can go ahead. So one of our commitments is to try to give a new dimension for climate change in the economy. We want to mainstream climate change into the economy, and obviously this includes trade as one of the very important points. And why do we want to do that? Because when we created the climate change regime, and even when we were negotiating Paris, we still believed that funds could be the best way to get the results we needed, like we had in the most successful diplomatic effort, I think, of the history of the UN. At least it's what many people believed, which was the Montreal Protocol of the Vienna Convention on the depletion of the ozone layer, in which in a few decades we eliminated 95% of the gases that provoked it. And last month we had the good news that the ozone layer is being restored, and it is the result of diplomats. Diplomats can be useful. So we believed then that we could have funds that would cover the additional cost of a development that incorporates climate change in developing countries. And the truth is that even if we have the funds, even if we have the resources, and even if, as a developing country, I know that the countries that are historically responsible for the emissions have committed to provide these funds, the truth is that the amounts have risen significantly. And as you probably know, I have to present a little before COP30 with the president of COP29. We have to present the roadmap to 1.3 trillion, the from Baku to Belém roadmap, in which we have to bring all the elements that would allow us to have 1.3 trillion by 2035. So this effort will obviously have to involve all the institutions we have created. And there I come back to the priority of President Lula. And President Lula was very clear when I started this job, is that his first priority is the strengthening of multilateralism, and he was very clear today at the UN General Assembly in his speech about that. But the second thing he said is that we need to show to people what these negotiations are for, because many people have disengaged from this agenda because they think, God, lots of papers, no results, and we know it's not true. If it was not for those negotiations, we would not have developed many technologies. Most countries would have not have the policies that they have today. But we have to explain that better, and with that I totally agree, obviously, with President Lula. So this bringing the negotiation to people's life and showing the difference it is making to people's life. And the third priority of President Lula is that we need to go beyond the UNFCCC and the Paris Accord for the implementation. So we have to strengthen UNFCCC and the Paris Accord for the negotiation, and we have to have a much more ample look at how we can implement. And that is why, by the way, one of the reasons that we created, among other circles that are supporting the presidency of the COP, the Circle of Finance Ministers, because we believe that once the COP is over, even the ministers that have negotiated, mostly ministers of climate, when they go back home, they want economy-wide application of what happened in the negotiations. And obviously ministers of finance are much better positioned to make sure that climate enters into the whole heart of government. So I wanted to start a bit with these themes. I think we're going to have a discussion, and as was already said, I will have to run after the discussion, so I'm sorry. So I'm going to stop here so that we can have a good chat. Thank you very much.
Great, that's working. Excellent. Ambassador, thanks so much, and thanks for your very impressive and strong leadership of COP30 in what's been a challenging time in a lot of ways. And I just wanted to ask you to expand upon that. It was helpful to hear you describe what the goals are and what the vision is for success in COP30. But a lot of the conversation we're having in New York this week at Climate Week, and more broadly with the UN General Assembly, is sort of the background is shifting. Conversation about energy security is much more front and center, energy affordability, geopolitical, kind of fracturing of the geopolitical environment, words like pragmatism and realism. We need more of that. What does that mean for climate ambition, and what does it mean for how you approach leadership at COP30?
Well, I think it means that we have to explain much better how we are going to improve energy security, how we're going to improve energy access, and how we're going to lower costs by adopting policies that take into consideration climate change. So I believe that this is an important shift in the perception of what renewables are. So renewables, normally they came with lots of subsidies because they were more expensive, but it was good for climate, and also because we all agreed 2 years ago in Dubai that we are going to transition away from fossil fuels. So there is, the logic was different. Now, if you introduce the argument of energy security, which is the strong argument for China to adopt all those renewable energies. They don't depend on anybody to have this energy. So I believe that the argument works with basically all countries in different ways because as we said very much in the G20 and we continue now, is that we need energy transitions, no? Because it's going to be different according to the country. In the case of Brazil, it's different depending on the region of Brazil. Some regions need one solution, some regions another. So I think it's a switching of the argument of how combating climate change can be good for the economy. And I think that this argument we've been losing a little because I think that the negative aspects have been insisting on the economic side. By the way, an important leader today mentioned this extensively. But we believe that the economic argument favors this agenda.
Losing meaning the argument that a faster transition is undermines those goals of it, and you're saying we got to explain why that's wrong.
Yeah, no, well, it's not what's wrong or what is right, but it is the perception that these things still need lots of subsidies. The lack of knowledge of the fact that solar energy now is the cheapest energy in all the countries in the world. So all this information all this happened very quickly. Even if you compare to the Paris Agreement, when we were signing the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, these things I'm saying now were not realities, and they are today.
It was really helpful to hear you describe a little more about what the Integrated Forum on Climate Change and Trade is and will try to achieve. And I'm delighted that the work we've been doing at the center with our dialogue helped to inform what you launched. I just was curious because Brazil has been kind of leading the charge against some of these so-called unilateral mechanisms like the carbon border adjustment, and now you're positioning yourselves as a neutral convener to have these conversations. What's the reaction been from other countries to the forum that you launched, and how are you kind of making that pivot to position yourselves, to convene conversations on these issues?
I think it goes back a little to the thing that I said, that it becomes irrelevant to be right if you can't get action and if you believe in the urgency. The element of urgency is basically revolutionary in climate change, because when we started negotiating it, and I didn't start so early, I know some people did, were in Kyoto, by the way. No, I'm kidding, because Elliot told me he started in Kyoto. He was a child, obviously, but what's changed enormously in the negotiations of climate change is the sense of urgency. So we had the scientific information, but scientific information has progressed enormously. And in the case of Brazil, the threats that climate change is posing, for instance, for the Amazon forest, has a very strong impact on the fact that most of Brazil's agriculture, we are the second largest exporter of agriculture in the world, and most of the Brazilian agriculture is rain-fed. And it's rain-fed thanks to the evaporation of the Amazon forest. So the savanization of the Amazon forest is an enormous threat to Brazil's economy and to Brazil's exports. So the knowledge, the increase of knowledge on how threatened we are by climate change, and the fact that we had a very intense acceleration of of exceptional events in many countries, and obviously in Brazil last year it was really a disaster. This has completely changed the perception on how climate change has to be taken into consideration with the urgency element. I've just been to Addis Ababa to the meeting of African countries on climate, the summit on climate. And it is fantastic because all the countries we talk to, all the leaders we talk to, there is absolutely no denialism because they all have been victims of climate change in an accelerated way, in an intensive way. And so they want to look ahead, they want to find solutions. So we continue to have the same positions from the point of view of what we think is fair is not fair, but we have to try to find something that will lead to progress and not to stall. Because unfortunately, that's a little what we have.
And for COP30's action agenda, talk a little bit about maybe how the Forum on Climate and Trade sort of fits into that.
Yeah, in the action agenda, we decided to structure it into six axes and 30, let's say, priorities. And this is being very well received because first, it's all things that have been approved at the GST, at the Global Stock Take. But not only because of that, but also because we took all the initiatives of the last 10 years of Action Agenda and we examined, and it's more than 500, and we examined which ones had progressed, which ones had results, which ones wanted to continue. And based on these efforts, we made sure that the discussion is going to be led by people that have already been discussing this. I hate the idea of reinventing the wheel, and by the way, in the dialogue between WTO and UNFCCC, it is going to be the same. We don't want to change one or another. We just want to have a way forward that takes into consideration urgency.
I know you need to leave in just a moment, but I don't want to, I hope you won't leave without offering some comments. We're sitting here in New York, again, with the background of the UN General Assembly talking about broader geopolitical issues, not just climate change. And it's hard not to be cognizant of the tensions in the relationship between the US and Brazil. People will have heard or are reading news reports about the comments from our president today. And I'm wondering how you view Brazil's role in countering some of the moves coming out of Washington, issues more broadly related to trade and immigration and the rule of law. How does that affect how you approach trying to bring people together around climate at COP30? And how do you secure your own interests, but also try to make sure that we continue to move forward with a rules-based global order?
Well, I'm going to start very diplomatically. There are infinitely more positive dimensions in the Brazil-US relationship than what is being stressed of some aspects that have been raised. So I think that the base of the relationship is so strong that we can somehow adapt. And then there is another thing that I believe that both leaders believe very much, is that you and I learned that, by the way, in my first negotiation with an American negotiator. I disagreed with him on everything and we couldn't have an agreement, but at the end he told me, you know, we totally disagreed and this didn't work at all, but I have to tell you, we only respect countries that respect themselves. We prefer a country that stays in the line of what he really believes than one that changes just to have a result that is not going to be good for neither. So I think that it's a bit in that direction. We must make sure that our constituency, our countries understand that the leader of the country is defending the main interests of the country. And it's totally normal that sometimes it's not the same position. So I think that if we see that both countries respect each other, we can certainly find a solution.
And can you give us, just as you depart, sort of a final word? You talked a lot about what the plans are for COP, the implementation of COP, but just at a high level, what does success look like? How do we know if it happened? And what can people in this room do to help make that happen. Many will be involved in various ways and be attending most likely.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for asking me a very difficult question. I think that we need to have results in many layers. So we need to have results, I think, that civil society recognize. We need to have results that leaders recognize. We obviously need to strengthen the negotiation and have specific results on the negotiations that are the essence of the COP is the negotiation. But I believe that the action agenda can bring also lots of hope that really this agenda is economically positive. And I think that if we get some progress, a sense that we are progressing at all these levels, I believe that we can say that the COP was a success. But obviously, this involves many actors, and you cannot prejudge what the other actors are doing. And the presidency has to be conscious that it can only do as much as the other parties also want to participate. But I am feeling that there is a very strong understanding of the symbolism of COP30 at this moment of extreme, let's say, questioning of multilateralism and the questioning of the fact that the international economy is not favoring anymore the poorest, the most vulnerable. So I think that there are all these elements that we can bring to COP30 to renew the faith in multilateralism and in international cooperation.
Ambassador, I know you have an incredibly busy week. We're really grateful to you for making time. Good luck with the months to come. And we look forward to deepening the partnership we've had at the Center on Global Energy Policy with the government of Brazil, not just on climate and trade, but many other issues. I'm going to turn the program in a moment to my colleague, Elliot Diringer, who's forgotten more about the COP process than I'll ever know and has been working diligently at this for decades. But first, please join me in giving a round of applause to the ambassador.
Thank you.
Okay, while our final speaker makes his way up to the stage, I'm Elliot Diringer, a global fellow here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and has been mentioned, I have been running our international dialogue on climate and trade. It's a real pleasure to welcome up some close friends and colleagues, actually, for the next round of discussion. And I'm going to break protocol a little bit because I know Wael has to depart himself momentarily. He too has a very busy schedule. So rather than introducing the full panel, I'm just going to start with Wael, who is Assistant Foreign Minister for Climate and Sustainable Development for the government of Egypt. He previously was the lead climate negotiator, including when Egypt hosted COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh, and was most recently Egypt's ambassador to Brazil. Wael, thanks for joining us. Much of the discussion in our dialogue has been around the growth of green standards. One of the concerns we heard is that applying uniform standards to imported goods doesn't necessarily take into account differences among countries, whether that's differences in national circumstances and regulatory approaches or in levels of development. And some feel that green standards are becoming unfair barriers to trade. Is that a concern for Egypt? I know, for instance, that you are working hard to develop a green hydrogen industry. Do you think that green standards need to be differentiated in some way so that emerging economies can compete fairly in the net zero transition?
Yes, thank you very much, Elliot, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with, as you said, dear friends and colleagues with whom we've worked over the years. And apologies at the outset, of course, for jumping the line, cutting in front of colleagues, because I do have to rush to another thing. To your question, of course, like every reasonable country, you recognize the value of green standards. There's no doubt about that. They provide credibility and avoid greenwashing and other positive elements that everyone will acknowledge. Our issue is not with the concept of green standards themselves, but rather with the way these standards are being devised and applied. today. That's what raises our concerns, and I'll try to run through a few of our concerns. One of our main concerns is that uniform standards fail to account for the differences in circumstances and levels of development. Different countries have different starting points. That's something that we all accept and acknowledge. We, for example, in developing countries, particularly in Egypt as an example, face higher borrowing costs, less access to technologies, and sometimes weaker infrastructure needed to meet these standards. So the second concern is that standards that have been designed unilaterally without meaningful consultation with those expected to comply with them, leading to what I regret is an adversarial, more acrimonious approach by two sides of an issue that we fundamentally should be agreeing on and finding a way to move forward on. The third concern regards consistency and compatibility with the very climate regime that we've all constructed. The Paris Agreement clearly is based on NDCs, nationally determined contributions. Every country, this is a bottom-up agreement, not a top-down one that dictates commitments that we accepted in the negotiations. So it is a bottom-up, nationally determined contribution. Every country gets to determine, based on its capacities and capabilities, what contribution it can make to the global effort. So it would appear that effectively imposing a top-down requirement, if you want to continue to trade with a certain partner, seems like a backdoor evading and negating the notion of nationally determined. So our stance is not against standards per se, rather it is about how they are designed and implemented. We believe they need to be differentiated in their implementation and phased, reflecting CBDR-RC, which is common but differentiated responsibilities. Developing countries should be given adequate time to and support. We also believe standards must be paired with support. Obviously, finance. It is essential for any country if it wants to expedite its decarbonization process for its relevant industries to be provided with the support necessary for that. In addition, of course, to the capacity to understand the standards and meet the standards and the technology needed to, again, expedite its transition away from carbon intensity. Finally, we need to recognize that there are different technological pathways to producing, for example, green hydrogen, because you mentioned it, or other green products. Standards must be flexible enough to recognize these different pathways. And again, this is an issue that we had brought to the table in our COP27, the issue of just transition pathways. André, Ambassador de Lago, mentioned the fact that there are definitely going to be 192 or 93 different pathways. No country is the same. The starting points are not different. The capacities and the particularities, whether it relates to transitions away from fossil fuels or other parts of the economic transition to sustainability. So in short, yes, Egypt does have concerns that if applied without differentiation, green standards could become a new form of protectionism. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Wael. And while the question may have been about green standards in particular, I think your response has helped to surface a lot of the cross-cutting themes and issues that we hear throughout discussions around climate and trade. So thank you for getting us off to a good start, and we'll understand if you need to take your leave at any moment. So let me move on then and introduce the rest of the panel. To my immediate right, we have Dougal McInnes, who is Assistant Secretary in the United States branch for the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Thank you for stepping in. We have Jake Werksman of the European Commission. Jake is Principal Advisor for International Aspects of EU Climate Policy and has been the EU's lead climate negotiator for, I think, about as long as anybody can remember. He is presently spending a year here in New York, actually, as the Senior Emile Noel Fellow at the NYU School of Law. Congratulations on that, Jake. Julio Cordano of Chile. Julio is Director of Environment, Climate Change, and Oceans in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He too was a lead climate negotiator when his country hosted a COP25. I understand played a very central role in the negotiation of the High Seas Treaty, which has just crossed the threshold for entry into force. So congratulations for that, Julio. So I'm going to turn next to Jake. Jake, the EU obviously has been at the forefront of climate ambition for many years, and through its CBAM, its carbon border adjustment mechanism, is working to help strengthen climate ambition globally as well. I guess it's no secret that CBAM has become, I suppose, the tallest lightning rod in the storm brewing around climate and trade. Wael invoked the term climate protectionism. I think that has been, CBAM has been branded climate protectionism many times. But in the course of our dialogue, I think that we saw actually a more nuanced picture. Some from developing countries acknowledged that CBAM has been helpful in advancing discussion of carbon pricing options within their governments. And some now are even talking about adopting their own form of carbon border measures. So tell me, how do you read the various responses to CBAM, and what are some of the questions those responses raise for you?
Thanks, Elliot. Thank you for this, but also for the great initiative that you've been running out of Columbia that has obviously been so influential as to inspire Brazil itself to try to take the conversation forward in the context of this COP. And I think that they're actually imagining this forum would run for 3 years. So obviously it's a commitment over the longer term to try, if I understand their objective, to try to create a more constructive space than we've been able to create so far in the UNFCCC negotiations or in the WTO to address concerns around policies like the EU's CBAM. I think in order for it to succeed, it needs to do just that. It has to create a more constructive space. And for me, I wouldn't quite agree with Ambassador de Lago's characterization of the problem being one about jurisdiction and unwillingness in the WTO to talk about climate. I haven't seen that. I've been in many conversations in and around the WTO, the Committee on Trade and Environment, the TBT Committee, in which policies like the EU CBAM have been discussed at length. I've also been in conversations in the UNFCCC where we have signaled, at least from the EU, that we're prepared to talk about trade in that context as well, but not in a way that frames the issue in a prejudicial way from the outset, not in a way that focuses specifically on one region or one party's policies with a view to demonstrating that it is a unilateral coercive measure, but rather one in which we look at the situation where we are in, which I think is a result of the Paris design, as Wael described it, where we're each encouraged to put in place nationally determined measures that are as ambitious as possible. This then creates asymmetries between our markets, in which we have to reconcile differences in the way in which we're approaching, including through trade-related climate measures such as the CBAM, which is designed specifically to level the playing field between installations in the EU that are paying a high carbon price and their direct competitors overseas that want access to the EU market that aren't paying a high carbon price. So, I mean, in partial response to Wael's comments, but also, Elliot, to your question, how is the CBAM perceived and how is it affecting the international debate? I think it displays only one way in which a standard can be applied. And for this purpose, as I said, the standard is being applied primarily to level the playing field between our producers and installations and their international competitors. But standards can be used for many, many purposes. I mean, so for the purposes of green procurement, the consumer wants to know that steel that it's being asked to buy is produced in the absolute low carbon way possible through production methods that produces as little carbon dioxide emissions as possible, for example. In that context, would that consumer be interested in the level of development of the country that produced that steel? Is that the way markets currently operate? In that context, it might be quite difficult to build into an internationally agreed standard something that differentiates on that basis. As much as we might perceive it as being a fairer approach to shaping markets than the one in which describes that Wael described. I think the other thing important about setting standards is you have to start with some common understanding of what the standard is intended to reflect. So in the scenario that I described, where you're measuring the amount of steel, the amount of carbon associated with a particular steel process, there is an empirical challenge there that is relatively easily overcome in the context of a conversation amongst experts. It's an imperial question, right? If you ask the question instead, how would you differentiate between steel produced in Chile, steel produced in China, steel produced in Egypt, in such a way that fairly reflected their different levels of development, you would move into a much more contested political, and I would suggest sometimes ideological discussion about what fairness is in that particular context. And I worry about processes that are set up to create markets that are transparent, that deliver consumers what it is that they say that they want, and at the same time trying to inject into that conversation ideas of principle or concepts of principle that are highly contested even amongst those countries that describe themselves as developing. I mean, I'm not sure that whether Chile, China, and Egypt sat down together and tried to construct the kind of approach that Wael described, they would be able to agree amongst themselves. So CBAM is a lightning rod. It's also a very live experiment. I mean, the EU is designing it and redesigning it in part in response to concerns and complaints that are being raised by our trading partners. We went through a process of simplification very recently. It's about to be approved, which will, in response to concerns of our trading partners about administrative burdens, will now reduce the number of importers that are required to report and comply with CBAM by 90%. And still cover 90% of the emissions that it's intended to cover. And my guess is that over time there will be more reforms of this nature as well to make sure that the CBAM is actually being implemented in a cost-effective and environmentally effective manner. One last point, Elliot, is that I think what we're looking forward to in this space, and this goes to Ambassador de Lago's themes around accelerating implementation and needing to respond to urgency, is that we're seeing more and more jurisdictions around the world, including Brazil, putting in place carbon pricing systems, cap and trade systems, in which in a very short period of time, they will be confronting the same kind of design challenges that the EU itself is trying to deal with. If you have a high carbon price as compared to your trading partner, how do you deal with the risk of carbon leakage? And we can, in the near future, have conversations that are much more about comparing experiences, facing common challenges, rather than the kind of more political and ideological exchanges and finger pointing that we've seen in the UFCCC process, for example, so far. Thanks.
Thanks, Jake. I'm going to turn to Julio now. Julio, I know that as a smaller country, Chile places a very high value on rules-based multilateralism. I also know that Chile has worked very hard at the bilateral level to draw closer ties between trade and the environment. For instance, in your free trade agreements with the EU, with the US, with other countries in your region, they include commitments on environment and/or climate change. So, what are the key issues here from Chile's perspective? And with multilateralism facing such strong headwinds right now, what role do you see for coalitions of the willing?
Well, thank you very much, Elliot. And before my good friend Wael left, I told him that I was going to say that I agree with him in many aspects. But I think it's important to and I would like to start by maybe referring to one of the last ideas that Ambassador Corrêa Lago mentioned, his story about his negotiation with an American counterpart, where sometimes, interests that does not allow to see eye to eye and maybe to not find a common ground where an agreement can happen. And I have the feeling that when we're talking about how to make sure that the trade and climate can evolve into something that is consistent with the Paris Agreement, that is contributing to a low-emission economy, sometimes we miss maybe that space where we can actually build something that can serve and respond to the interests of everyone. Because I think many of the issues that Wael raised are very legitimate, and it's definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration. Imagine that standards that can be developed that definitely will represent a transition from one point to the other, and you know, many developing countries will not have the same level of technology and the ability to to adapt to new markets that will require low carbon products. So this is national interests that need to be taken into consideration, and I think the concept of just transition in the UNFCCC, but elsewhere as well, has gained a lot of traction and momentum because of that. And thank you also for mentioning that Chile is a country that believes in free market. We have based our development strategy precisely on an open economy. We started our free trade agreements back in the 90s, and right now we have 35 agreements of free trade agreements. Out of them, we have about 20 that have environmental chapters, and about 6 or 7 that have specific climate references. So making that connection between trade and climate definitely something that is not strange to us. But at the same time, we do believe in rules-based system that it is also fair, and we believe that we can find solutions to go forward, because we need to also look at into the other side of things. When we are all fighting to fight climate change, we are all trying to commit new and more ambitious NDCs. We are in the need to adjust our economies and to align our own development pathways to what the Paris Agreement says. In Chile, we have a climate change law, which is fairly recent. It's about 3 or 4 years old, that establishes that we will have to have maximum amount of emissions per sector of the economy. And that will be coupled with as Jay was saying, with policies of carbon pricing. So the industry, the agriculture sector, the transport sector will all feel the pressure to reduce emissions and favor, therefore, products that will contribute to those policies. So trade, and since Chile is such an open economy, definitely will impact our trade policies. So we want to have a role in that transition. And I think, when we talk about standards, for example, and this is very relevant to this initiative in particular, it is important to say that as we make progress in our decarbonization, we will need to have rules. We will need to have transparency. We will need to have, clear rules, because the absence of rules makes the life more difficult to everyone, increases the compliance cost, increases uncertainty, and of course the private sector hates uncertainty, which is fair enough. But also, it's not about imposing anything. I think this is the ideal that we see. We don't want standards that are, developed in a closed room and imposed to the rest of the world. We want to see something that is, the participation of everyone. It is clear, and maybe, instead of imposing anything, it should be based on interoperability. And this is one of the principles of the Climate Club, and we will hear more about that later. But the last point I wanted to make is that well-managed, a good coordination between climate and trade can actually accelerate climate transition, precisely because we will find opportunities to decarbonize as we are favoring, as we are aligning the trade with our climate policy. So the question is really how to fine-tune that transition to make sure that everybody's comfortable and there is no trade deviation, for example, and other things that, of course, the WTO is already discussing. So I will leave it there, but I think it's an opportunity at the end of the day. I think I would say that we would also like to congratulate Brazil for taking this step. I think it's a needed piece in the puzzle of the climate policies.
Thanks, Julio. With Wael's departure, we have an empty seat next to Julio. I'm going to invite up one more speaker. Yeah. Welcome, Dave. This is Dave Banks, a colleague of ours at CGEP. Dave, among many other hats that he wears, is a non-resident fellow at CGEP, also the COO of the American Council on Capital Formation. Dave, unlike the other members of this panel, you don't presently serve in government, but you were formerly with the NSC in the first Trump administration, and we'll come back to you in just a moment, okay? But for now, I'm going to turn to Dougal. So Dougal, you're stepping in for Australia's new climate change ambassador, Will Naverkis, and I know this is a very busy week for the Australian team because you have hopes of hosting next year's COP, COP31, so I'm sure that's keeping your climate ambassador very busy, making the rounds, trying to make sure that you do in fact become the COP president next year. But thank you for making the time to be here. Ambassador de Lago, has described for us Brazil's plan for an integrated forum on climate change and trade. What do you see as the value of deeper dialogue at the intersection of climate and trade? And what would you say are Australia's priorities in this space?
Thanks, Elliot. Thanks for having me, and thanks to the centre. And I'm going to have to apologise soon. I'm going to have to duck off for a minute because I think the President's going to lock down the bit of the city I need to get through back to the UN soon. But thank you so much for having me. And it's a bit of a return to having done climate work at the COP, including with Jake and others years ago. I mean, I think climate and trade have danced around each other for many years. And you take an issue like response measures in the UNFCCC, and that is fundamentally a trade issue, but for many years we could not talk about it explicitly in those ways. Australia has been through a long and some would say maybe tortured public policy process of looking at fundamentally that intersection between trade and climate. We had a carbon tax, we had a carbon price, and we lost several governments as a result of that, and now we have a much more stable policy setting. I might set through that and then come back to your question. So Australia's key elements are, we have just set an NDC to 2035. It's an ambitious one, it's an achievable one. It takes the economy into account, 62 to 70% of 2005 levels. And as you said, Elliot, the other element of our climate policy is to host the COP next year, in close concert with our Pacific family, and we're having lots of discussions this week with relevant parties about that. But for us, the international trade bit and international investment policy settings, are inseparable from achievable, ambitious, sustainable climate policies. And I guess for us, we need to find ways of better connecting those issues. We see some value and merit in the Brazil proposal. We're not, we're giving it careful consideration. We're not there yet to say that Australia's going to back a new body or element, but we're certainly giving it careful consideration. But we're also mindful of the role that the FCCC plays on climate, and then the role that the WTO plays in the rules-based order for international trade, and how we can get greater collaboration and exchange between those bodies, and but also accepting that both those bodies can't solve this issue in and of themselves. I mean, we are also doing things beyond the plurilateral and multilateral. We're doing things bilaterally. Just last month, the Prime Minister went to China and announced that we were looking at green steel cooperation with China, because Australia understands that, the economic success of Australia and our commodity outputs relies upon working with our big trade partners on sustainable climate policies. So we are looking at those kind of elements. But I would say that from the Brazil proposal, we're giving it careful consideration, and we're sort of all ears and looking to work further on that.
Thanks, Dougal. So over to you, Dave. As I mentioned, you served on the National Security Council in the first Trump administration. You've also been very deeply involved in efforts in Congress over the years to legislate around carbon and trade. Given what you've heard about some other countries' actions and interests in this space, what do you think is the right play for the United States? And given this administration's aggressive approach to trade on the one hand, and its complete antipathy to climate on the other hand, do you see any of this ever finding a place within a Trump trade agenda?
Those are several different questions and a lot to bite off there. But so to your point, I've spent a lot of time working on a U.S. policy design related to climate and trade. And we certainly are kind of still on our journey within the Congress in these kind of conversations, and we have a lot of sort of Republican engagement with Democrats. So we have an evolving bipartisan position on climate and trade policy. Okay, so my opinion as to what the right play is, the right play, now this is obviously not realistic at this point for a number of different reasons, but the right play is for the United States to work with its partners and allies and everyone that wants to be engaged in this issue to really try to develop a common approach, right? And I think the common approach would be, related to the accounting. We have to agree on the math. How do you move forward? How do you figure this out? I don't think it can be policy dependent. A lot of the speakers sort of echoed the point that you have different national circumstances that don't really allow for really, really close policy alignment. And so really what that means in practice is that it needs to be environmental or emissions performance, right? So that would be what I would argue, and I think the United States should play an important role in doing that. Now let's talk about the real world and the politics of today with the administration. It's a tough issue, right? You heard the president, or may have missed that, but earlier today he really spent some time criticizing climate policy. And I think it's important to know where he's coming from. And I think for a lot of the energy and environment policy making circles within the administration, right? It's kind of a leftover Kyoto hangover, right? We're still kind of dealing with it. But clearly the president, when he looks at this policy, he looks at it through the lens of what kind of impact does this have on U.S. competitiveness? What kind of impact does this have on manufacturing, on the defense industrial base, and just kind of where things are with this administration in particular? Whether it's right or wrong, we can obviously argue some of those points, but they believe that the wrong climate policy undermines U.S. national security, right? And again, whether it's right or wrong, they will point to Germany, other parts of Europe that have pursued aggressive climate mitigation, and they will blame the industrialization of certain parts of Europe, for example, on climate policy. That's just where they are. And look, I think that doesn't have to be the paradigm that we as Republicans totally accept. But that's just kind of the reality at this point. My favorite quote from a climate skeptic was from Senator Jim Inhofe, who said that I used to believe in climate change until I realized how expensive the solutions were going to be, right? And I think that that's kind of where a lot of the people are in the administration who work on energy environment issues, and I think that's where the president is. Now, the trade team is in a very different place, right? So the trade team, and I would say from USTR to Commerce to Treasury, they look at this issue just through the lens of math, right? And they see a potential U.S. carbon advantage relative to U.S. competitors, and they just look at the numbers and go, why don't we monetize this? Let's slap a tariff on it or a fee. And so for them, it's not ideological. It's just what they think makes sense. Now, carbon is a complicating factor, but what you've seen is a number of public remarks related to foreign pollution as an unfair trade practice. You saw that in the president's remarks back in April. You saw it in the Earth Day announcement. You've seen it repeated multiple times by, again, the senior trade team. So I think that there is clear sort of dedication and commitment to pursuing this idea that foreign pollution can be used, by lax environmental standards and enforcement compliance can be used by countries to create an artificial competitive advantage in trade. And so I think it's highly likely that they will pursue some type of unilateral action related to foreign pollution over the next few years. Now, if you look at the trade team is heavily influenced by Bob Lighthizer, even though the ambassador is not in Trump 2.0, he still has a lot of influence. His acolytes, his alumni, they're scattered across the administration. He's publicly supported a CBAM without a price on carbon. Right, so you have that openness within the trade community, but again, carbon's complicated, and so for them, even though privately they might be willing to say we don't have a problem using CO2 as a metric, they obviously have to deal with the politics that we know of when it comes to sort of the president and the administration's position related to climate policy. Okay. But I think the good news here, I think that for, so Senator Kramer had an interesting conversation with the president earlier this year, and he brought up carbon tariffs. And so the president was like, well, you know how much I love tariffs? He's like, but carbon's complicated. But I think importantly, he didn't say no and just reject the idea. So I think it's very difficult politically for them at this point to sort of embrace that type of approach. But having said that, if they go through this process of trying to figure out foreign pollution, what do we count? How do you come up with the value of the subsidy related to this unfair trade practice for illegal logging or for oceans plastics? They may just land on just using CO2 as a proxy because it's easier to do than some of these other pieces, right? As a proxy for traditional and conventional pollution. So, but yeah, if you were going to ask me the prospects of a CBAM, certainly would require divided government to move forward. And if the House flips, for example, I think there's prospects for it. Obviously, go up a lot, but it would look a lot like Senator Bill Cassidy's bill related to the Foreign Pollution Fee Act without a price on carbon than, say, Senator Whitehouse's bill that has a domestic fee. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. I think that there's a lot to pick up on there. The idea that at some stage the administration might premise tariffs on carbon content would assume that the administration thought it was important to have an empirical and rational basis for imposing tariffs. So maybe they'll get there. So I think we've got time for one or more follow-ups. Yeah, okay, great. So, we've heard a lot of reference, not surprisingly, to the WTO and the UNFCCC. the established multilateral regimes that have primacy in the trade and climate worlds, respectively. But obviously, in the fact that Brazil is now launching a forum, an integrated forum. I think the integrated is an allusion to trying to bring these realms closer together. An integrated forum on climate change and trade. There's some recognition that we need to step outside the formal WTO and UNFCCC processes in order to make some progress. If this forum does, in fact, succeed, though, in establishing some common ground, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on where you would envision any outcomes from those discussions being operationalized. Would it be within those established multilateral institutions? Would it perhaps be some established or new plurilateral undertaking, or would it be primarily through bilateral agreements? So I'm asking you to look down the road. What are the forums through which we actually think we might be able to turn into concrete whatever common understandings we're able to achieve in the forum?
What's the time frame?
Well, the forum,
A year,
as
5
Jake
years,
noted,
20 years?
As Jake noted, the forum is expected to run for 3 years. So its outputs would be 3 years from COP30. How does that affect your answer, Dave?
With Trump 2.0. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the prospect of the administration engaging on a climate and trade policy within sort of that is anchored by the COP and the WTO, two things that they don't like, I think is really slim. I do think there's an openness, right, or there could be an opening in a few years once the dust settles. I think to your point, people figure out what existing authorities can and can't do when it comes to trade policy. Because what we're talking about is a new idea, right, a new sort of set of authorities. I do think that there will be interest in coming up, again, working with key trading partners when it comes to the math, and the accounting, and how do you measure these kind of things. Because I do believe, as I said before, that there's a lot of interest on the part of the administration to use existing authorities to pursue this idea that foreign pollution can be an unfair trade practice.
But do you see that through a unilateral made in U.S.
Probably
policy?
Bilateral, unilateral first.
Yeah, and then negotiated bilaterals.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Julio?
Well, I think every time that you find yourself in a process that aims at having clear rules and maybe developing standards that can be widely accepted, I think first of all you need to sort of design what you want to achieve, but maybe you cannot prejudge what exactly the outcome will be. And as we saw in this discussion, it's quite a complex endeavor. To me, it would be logical to follow kind of the model of a forum where we have a more technical discussion instead of a political discussion aiming at an outcome predetermined, and explore the different consequences of the different options that we might have. But ultimately, the ideal would be to have something that can be accepted multilaterally. Hopefully, the UNFCCC is a hard one. It's been quite politicized, the discussion on trade for a long time. But probably WTO can also serve some purposes of that. But ideally, it would be a multilateral agreement. But it would need to be built on top of a technical discussion that can provide certainties to everyone.
I mean, just briefly, I mean, we're also looking at the Brazilian proposal with interest, and we're asking not only what its outcomes would be, but who would participate in it, who's interested in it, how would it be led, how would it be supported with technical expertise such as would be necessary, and how it would add value to the existing initiatives. I think in the next panel is going to be looking at the Climate Club, which is operating a very similar space, the IFCMA, which is run out of the OECD, which is also looking at similar challenges of how do you strengthen interoperability of things like carbon accounting standards. Neither of which have yet attracted Brazil to them, and maybe having something that is led by Brazil and has the participation of some countries that haven't yet joined those other initiatives could be one way in which it added value. But again, that raises the question is who's interested in playing. As a negotiator, I mean, certainly one thing that it could add value to is to prevent this COP and future COPs from having extended agenda item fights about whether or not we have to have a dedicated agenda on unilateral measures, but I'm not sure whether Brazil is in a position to promise that through this initiative either. But we're keeping an open mind, and we're watching the space closely, and certainly all of the spirit with which it was just offered by Ambassador de Lago is a spirit that we would encourage and see as leadership. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Jake, for beginning to introduce our next session. In fact, it's time to hand things over to my colleague Trevor Sutton, who will introduce the next session. But first, if everyone could please just join me in a round of applause to thank our speakers.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jake, for taking a little bit of the load off me and giving us a preview of this session, and typically putting it more eloquently than I ever could have. So I am Trevor Sutton. I am a senior researcher at the Center for Global Energy Policy, where I direct a program on trade and clean energy. And it's my great pleasure to be moderating our second panel. Now, in the first panel, we heard a range of regional and national government perspectives on climate and trade. In this panel, we're going to be shifting our focus a bit to some of the more prominent multilateral initiatives touching on climate and trade. And we have a fantastic group of panelists. Joe Tyndall, who is Director of the Environmental Directorate at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Vitor Vaz, Climate and Trade Advisor at the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Lutz Morgenstern of the German Federal Ministry of Climate Action and, I had this memorized, Environment, that's right, thank you so much. So I'm just gonna start with Joe. Joe, in the international dialogues on climate and trade that CGEP has convened over the past year, one topic that has come up again and again is carbon accounting. And for those who aren't familiar, carbon accounting is how you measure the embedded emissions in goods and services. And in particular, there's been a lot of emphasis on the need for some level of convergence or alignment around carbon accounting methodologies. Now, the OECD has been the secretariat for the Inclusive Forum for Climate Mitigation Approaches, which has been taking a close look at carbon accounting. So I'm wondering if you can share any recommendations that have come out of the IFCMA's examination of carbon accounting, and also share with us any other relevant findings from the IFCMA that bear on trade and climate.
Turn on, some of them you don't, and now I'm here. Look, thanks very much for the introduction, and I have to say that the IFCMA, which is a little bit of a mouthful, didn't start by looking at the intersection between climate change and trade, but I think, as we've been hearing already this afternoon, this it's becoming increasingly obvious that this interconnection is going to come to the fore and needs to be addressed. So at first, the IFCMA, which interestingly brings together tax, economy, and environment ministries, was looking at how to understand better climate policy approaches and how to gauge the effectiveness of outcomes of those carbon mitigation approaches. But it became apparent that that carbon intensity metrics were becoming a topic of real importance. And I have to say, at the COP last year in Baku, this was an issue that came up in a number of different side events. The OECD was involved in, and it's a big crossover with the Climate Club, which we're going to hear about shortly. So we started doing this work because we felt it was quite clear that the ability to understand, measure the embedded emissions in products was going to have implications in terms of government procurement, of progress in decarbonising industry. Also, of course, carbon border adjustments that we've just been hearing about. So we've started to do some research and felt, to begin with, identify that maintaining a level playing field, particularly in the terms of companies, it's crucial that these carbon intensity metrics are accurate, granular, timely, and above all, comparable across countries. And I think that's been a theme that's starting to come through. But there are three key challenges that we identified in the first piece of research that we've done. First of all, getting accurate data on carbon intensity metrics is technically challenging or costly, and there's often a lack of guidance around calculating metrics, as well as difficulties in verifying and sharing data, indeed, across the supply chain. And that really impedes the comparability of those metrics. Second, again, possibly or probably as a result of the structural approach to the Paris Agreement that's been discussed today, that kind of bottom-up, nationally determined approach, many different calculation and reporting standards are emerging across countries and sectors, and that fragmentation risks significantly increasing compliance costs and, of course, standing in the way of international trade. And these challenges, again, we concluded, are even more pronounced for SMEs and also for developing countries, where there's often more immediate capacity and resource constraints that stand in the way. So I could go on a little bit longer to talk about some of the...
Please do.
Okay. So we came up with some suggestions for how to help policymakers. Three common principles needed to be kept in mind. First of all, it's really important to ensure proportionality. And by that, I mean finding a balance between the accuracy of data and the associated compliance cost. So if you go too far, obviously, along the road of accuracy, the compliance costs become completely prohibitive, particularly for business. Second, it's about promoting innovation and competition. The aim should be for policies to avoid disproportionate impacts on competition, because instead the aim is to encourage and maintain innovation and incentives and preserve open markets. Like all of these things, they can be a force for good or can pose risks and hamper, have downside impacts. And then the third area is around fostering interoperability. And there it's important to develop complementary processes, methods and infrastructure in different regions, countries and standards, and sectors rather, that share common foundations in order to avoid duplication and reporting requirements. So on that last point, on interoperability, we released 2 further reports in June of this year, which look at the quality and relevance of existing data sources and options to improve the monitoring, reporting and verification of the MRV systems. And the findings conclude that freely and commercially available databases are useful for tracking trends, but they often lack the granularity and transparency needed for policy making. And secondly, that aligning policy-mandated MRV systems across countries can really play a key role in reducing compliance costs for businesses and doesn't require full harmonisation, but rather tailored amendments. And we've looked at different layers of interoperability, from having a quite simply a consistency of terminology through to mutual acceptance or recognition. And I think I'll stop there in the interests of leaving some room for follow-up. But it's really been, I think, an extremely interesting area to get into, and it's given rise to a further issue that people are starting to focus on, and that is the impact of and implications of international spillovers. Which can be, again, a force for good or be a constraint or slow down the transition to a low-carbon economy in future.
Thank you so much, Joe. All right, I'd like to turn next to Lutz. Lutz, at COP28 saw the launch of the Climate Club, and for those of you who aren't familiar, the Climate Club is an international mechanism that is bringing together an expanding number of countries to focus on shared challenges at the intersection of climate and trade, and in particular, industrial decarbonization and carbon leakage. Germany, along with Chile, chairs the Climate Club. So I was hoping you could share with us, what has the Climate Club achieved so far, and where do you see it heading?
Okay, thank you, Trevor. Also, thank you for being on a panel at this really excellent event, and also thanking CGEP for having the dialogue on climate and trade. I had the honor to participate in the dialogue, and I found it really helpful over the course of the last months. So, on the Climate Club, it's an initiative that was, as you said, launched in 2022. It has 46 members. Interestingly, in the last panel, we really had a lineup of Climate Club countries, because you already said Chile and Germany are the co-chairs, but EU, Egypt, and Australia are all members of the steering group of the Climate Club. So that was, I don't know if it was a coincidence, but it was a good reflection, actually. There's a secretariat hosted by the OECD and IEA, and the focus is really on industry decarbonization, which in a sense might mean that it's a bit narrower than other initiatives that have a broader focus, also looking at other sectors. So we look at industry decarbonization, but in a very comprehensive way. And that means we address three of the main challenges that we see in the industry decarbonization. One that was already mentioned by Jake, by Joe, is that the goods produced by industry are traded globally. We have international markets, and the companies that produce these goods, they are faced with the regulation of ETSs and increasingly of carbon border mechanisms. So we want to avoid the complexities that arise, and this needs conversation. It first needs conversation on carbon leakage. What we did not want to have in the Climate Club is discuss specific instruments of single jurisdictions. What we said, what might be useful is to discuss the roots of this debate. So to understand why there are jurisdictions that actually are convinced that carbon leakage is a challenge, that they have to deal with it in order to continue their ambitious climate policies, why other countries have concerns and want their perspectives also to be brought to attention and to be considered. And actually, we succeeded in having a non-controversial dialogue that was rooted in excellent analysis provided by the OECD, and that really helped to improve a joint understanding, which we also captured in a statement that we issued at the last COP. And today, in 2 days here in New York at our site event of the Climate Club, we will launch principles of the Climate Club on carbon leakage that also capture this improved joint understanding. So this is one area. Second area is then directly on standards for green products. Green steel and green cements are the focus. And I think, Jake, you have explained that wonderfully, that companies and also consumers, they want to know what is green steel, and the companies want to know, if I produce steel in that way, can I sell it as green steel? Is this recognized? So, and that's a common sense of all members, that they are willing to work towards this common definition. And in last year, we have already captured the convergence on these definitions. And this is something that goes on in order to really also agree on concrete thresholds values for these products. And then the third and last pillar, and this is very important, and it was highlighted by our Egyptian colleague, is on providing support for investments in developing countries. Because for them, of course, the challenge to decarbonize their industries is much bigger. So we have set up a global matchmaking platform that matches the available support with the needs of developing countries. And I could tell about, but now our colleague has left, otherwise I would have told about the projects that have been initiated, for example, with Egypt over the global matchmaking platform, where we really helped on the ground to make the industry decarbonization in these countries possible. So this, in a way, is the way how we are structuring the work, and we're looking forward to present results of this work here in 2 days at our side event, and then also at COP30. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that event in New York in 2 days sounds like it'll be a great opportunity to get a sense into what you've been working on. So I'm now going to turn to Vitor. Vitor, the BRICS countries, of which Brazil is one, have been arguably the most prominent critics of so-called unilateral measures like the CBAM at the COP and in other international settings. And at the same time, the BRICS countries have been quite proactive in trying to shape the debate and conversation around climate and trade in a number of ways. For example, they have released a set of carbon accounting principles, and they have also created a laboratory on climate change, trade, and sustainable development. So my question to you is, what's the goal of these efforts, and how do you see them advancing cooperation around climate and trade?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Trevor, and a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm very happy to speak to the rationale of these two initiatives since they have been negotiated in the BRICS Contact Group on Climate Change and Sustainable Development, which I was chairing at the time. And I have to begin by saying that I am no stranger to some degree of CBAM bashing myself. This is mainly Jake's fault in the sense that when I do it, he will often calmly respond with a philosophical point, and it will lead to interesting conversations. And these concerns by BRICS countries with unilateral measures are indeed one of the building blocks, let's call it, of these initiatives. But let me surprise you by saying that I would say that the thrust of them was more turned inward than outward. And to explain this, perhaps it would be helpful for me to refer to a document that served as the main, let's call it the conceptual scaffolds that based all these initiatives, which was the BRICS Climate Leadership Agenda. And the main ideas underlining this agenda, there's an interesting thing that happens in the Brazilian government when Ambassador do Lago has an idea due to sheer coincidence, I end up having a similar one. So the underlying purpose of the climate leadership agenda was to look at what BRICS could do, not in terms of scoring political points or making political statements with regards to the intersection between trade and climate change, but actually what we could do with our own resources and our own capabilities to put forward solutions in the ground that would help us, that would address some of our own concerns and the landscape, the very challenging landscape that we have from an approach that we were calling something based on the idea of mutual empowerment. So what are the solutions that BRICS can put on to implement the more just landscape on the intersection between trade and climate change that we ourselves are defending? And I think we ended up, and it's we often see BRICS looked at as if we were a monolithic group, but in fact we are a very diverse one. And I would argue that we have within ourselves what could be a representative sample of the global South. So we have that diversity, and coming from that diversity, I would say that we have faced some of the same sticking points that Joe was describing there, and we had to answer to those same points. So for instance, we've come to the idea that without some sort of basis on carbon accounting, we end up not having, let's say, a common mitigation currency to base our coordination, in the sense that if you count emissions differently, you will not know what one apple that I did in terms of mitigation on my production system means in terms of the two pineapples that you have made in yours, and you need this Rosetta Stone to be able to translate what one means vis-a-vis what the other means. So coming to that same conclusion and some of the same challenges, we have looked at the work that has been done by the IFCMA. It was one of the inspirations, but we also asked ourselves, what are the things that we see just like them, and what are the things that we see differently? And then we came up with our own series of principles. So in a certain sense, I would say that for instance, we have on the IFCMA work, we have the idea of proportionality. And based on the reflections that we had within BRICS, what that become is the idea of inclusivity, in the sense that we not only have to be very worried about proportionality, but also we have to embed, when designing carbon accounting methodologies and systems, the idea that they should be designed in a way as to not leave out producers, not because they emit more, but because they don't have the resources and the capabilities to count emissions in a certain fashion. So we have to embed these considerations on addressing data gaps, on addressing financial bottlenecks in the design of those methodologies and systems themselves. And then there was the concern that was mentioned by Ambassador Wael before, in the sense that it's very important to fairness entails with treating similar producers under similar conditions equally, but it also means that we must treat producers under unequal circumstances unequally. So how do we capture a sense of equity in this? How do we put forward a framework for that allows us to embed a sense of positive differentiation on these schemes? And that was another consideration that was put forward in these principles. And I like very much the result we accomplished there, in the sense that it's not as if we and the OECD are speaking different languages. I think what we have come across is two sets of considerations that have both commonalities and differences, but they speak the same language. And what that means is that there is potential for us to also have a dialogue among ourselves. And then, of course, the main idea behind these principles was not to put forward opposition to the international dialogue, but rather to base future BRICS work on carbon accounting, so that we can also move forward on establishing our own common grammar for interoperability based on our own considerations. And I think that would be for the good of all, as we all need to step up ambition throughout our systems. Then on the laboratory, and I'm wary of the fact that I already took too much time, but on the laboratory, we have been arguing for some time that when countries apply hybrid measures with both trade and climate dimensions, they need to be cognizant of the spillovers over other countries and on their economies. So the idea here was that we have to apply that same consideration for ourselves, and we have to look at what we ourselves can do with regard to that. So how will that be operationalized within the laboratory? Through economic modeling. So we have these systems, GTAP, and those platforms that allow us to project and measure the effects of certain measures taken by both third countries, but also by BRICS members on ourselves, on our other economies. If we establish a network of compatible modules between different countries, what that means is that we can do a few things between ourselves. We can measure the effects of measures adopted by other countries on ourselves, but more important than that, we can measure the projected effects of our own measures in the world, in our own economies, to make sure that we are doing more good than harm. That when we adopt measures with trade and climate dimensions, that we are we are getting our value out of this. We are not, we are generating climate gains that are proportionate to any economic and social spillover effects coming of those measures. Then the second thing is that we can also project, again, our own measures, those effects, and we can project collective, both responses and our own measures, so that we can know beforehand, when we propose common approaches for BRICS members, what will be the outcomes of that in terms of environmental, social and economic outcomes. And that will, of course, help us have this platform for collaboration that will help us choose optimal policy outcomes when developing these common approaches. And then third, it will the laboratory will also help us develop what we're thinking of as a model for economic modeling that is adapted to the peculiarities, to the unique features of BRICS economies. And that is a concern because the models that we have here are often cannot capture some of the comparative advantages that we have to cut emissions in some of our sectors. So just to give you an example, if we did some no-till agriculture like we do in South Africa, we cannot capture the gains in terms of emissions curbing that would come out of this using GTAP. And if we have the resources, if we have the time, we can develop these systems and these unique methodologies for carbon accounting that are more attuned to our own economy so that we can map decarbonization pathways that are more efficient for our own climate efforts. So in a nutshell, again, I already spoken too much, but that was the concept that we have used to develop these ideas. Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you so much, Vitor. How are we doing on time? Do we have time for follow-ups? We do? Okay, great. Excellent. So this is open to any and all of the panelists. Earlier we heard Ambassador de Lago introduce the Integrated Forum. And I'm wondering, based on your involvement in other multilateral initiatives touching on trade and climate, what lessons do you take away for the Integrated Forum? What would help it achieve success? And how do you see complementarity between existing initiatives and the Integrated Forum? How do we ensure coherence? Anyone want to jump in? All right, Vitor.
Not too tired of hearing my voice, I'll just respond to this before anyone else has the chance to speak, of course. And to me, I think the main potential there, one lesson that we can learn, and specifically from this panel as well, is the need for what we are thinking of as a public square approach, in the sense that, and let me just explain this a bit better. When we hear, for instance, Joe explain the IFCMA, and when we look at our own initiative on carbon accounting, for instance, it's clear that we are both building boats, let's say. And one could argue many times, very often, the stories about how Joe's boat, for instance, will have an engine that will take us there faster, whereas our boat in BRICS would be a sail-based barger that might take longer, but we'll still get more people in there, let's say. But the reality of the fact is that we are both building boats. We are both driving towards the same goals, which is to decarbonize our economy while ensuring growth, ensuring social equity. And having a conversation might be a way for us to see and to look at many different cases. And it could be that once I might get the impression that Joe's boat will unfailingly sink. It's just a metaphor, Joe. I'm quite sure that your boat would never sink. But we might end up thinking that some of the elements that they have used for their boat is worth exploring for our own boat. And sometimes we might even get the idea that there might be an opportunity for boat building together, because that is the essence of things. But the only way to get these ideas and to get a pulse of this is if we have a space for a conversation that takes people out of their orbit, out of the orbit of stakeholders they usually listen to, and where we will have BRICS members hearing from the Climate Club, hearing from the OECD, and vice versa, and weighing in on these ideas. And I think the key to get there is to have the correct architecture, which is something that we have given a lot of consideration in the forum we are proposing, in the sense that we must have, I would say, 3 essential features. The first one, on which Ambassador de Lago touched upon earlier, is interdisciplinarity, a cross-cutting approach, in the sense that we need both trade and climate expertise in the same table, so that we can make policies that respond to the challenges of both sides. And we don't have a conversation that ends up getting limited by the expertise and mandate silos that often appear, that often arise under these conditions. And the second one is a mix, I would say, between structure, but also informality, in the sense that these are complex issues that take a lot of time to mature. If we have a one-off conversation on them, we won't get very far. This is how things are. But if people are just wearing their negotiation hats and they're just representing their countries and getting their national positions recorded, what will often happen is that we will exchange these very blanket statements of national position that will also not get us very far. So we need to have this degree of informality that will allow everyone to delve into substance, to, for instance, to engage with OECD and Climate Club ideas and BRICS ideas, but not feel compelled by them, not feel bound by them, and just offer their own input and just wade in. And that specific balance between structure and informality is very important for us to achieve a substantive debate. And the third one is to have a debate that is independent from both the UNFCCC and the WTO, so that, again, nothing that comes out of this feels binding to countries, so that we can all get into debating substance. And I think based on that, we would get this place where all the ideas could converge there to be discussed, and all government officials joining this forum would be challenged by the ideas coming from the other side of the aisle, and they would be engaging with them without feeling bound by them. And that in itself would lead to a synthesis that we think would add value to both the work of these organizations themselves, as they would be hearing feedback from members that are not always part of the debate, and with that to the collective intelligence we are developing around trade and climate issue, but also help us to look for solutions within the forum that work for everyone. So this is my long-winded point on response to you, Trevor, and I'll now let someone else talk.
Thank you so much, Vitor. Joe, you look like you wanted to come in.
Sure. Having, over the course of a very, very long career, experienced both the WTO, the trade side of things, and the climate side. And I do tend to agree with Ambassador de Lago at the beginning that it's very, very difficult to have a conversation in one of those forums about the issues facing the other. There is very much a territorial approach, but we've got to a point, I think, where we've got to move past that. And I think for slightly different reasons, trying to pursue this conversation within either the WTO or the UNFCCC is not going to provide us with the solutions. And I really want to pick up on one of Vitor's key points. It's going to be essential to have both the trade and climate people in the same room to have the conversation. I talked about the IFCMA, which has tax, economy, and environment ministries and policymakers. It does not have trade. I think Lutz has already indicated that the Climate Club has a narrower focus, looking at industry decarbonisation. So another point I think that's really important, I would emphasise from what Vitor says, is that it's not a bad thing to have these multiple kind of conversations going on, touching at different points of it. But what is needed at some point and in some way, and hopefully this forum that Brazil is talking about is a way to do this, is to kind of try and draw the threads together. So the other point I wanted to emphasise, I'm probably forgetting one of my points, but one of them is definitely to pick up also on the public forum idea. If everybody just comes into this restating the Bible that they have been quoting in either the WTO or the UNFCCC, it's not going to get us anywhere. It needs to be a kind of safe space. out of negotiation that may or may not see an outcome that is reflected directly in either the WTO or the UNFCCC, but does allow some form of boat to be built. And sailing is probably not so bad in the sense that it's not adding to global emissions. But we need a boat to be built, and the focus to be, to me, the success of the Paris Agreement was that it did encourage broader participation. So getting people on board is I think, our first focus.
Thanks. I think we have about 1 minute left, Lutz, if you wanted to offer any thoughts.
Yeah, maybe I need 1.5 minutes. But first of all, I'm glad that you didn't envision my boat to sink. and talking about boats, a focus on one sector, of course, can also allow a boat to go quite quick, no? because you have that clear focus. But you asked about the overlaps, and on the overlaps, I cannot give a final answer because, to be honest, we didn't receive the proposal on the IFCCT yet. So, but once we receive it, we will have a careful consideration and looking forward to understand it better. You asked about advice that we could give, and I have 6 very quick topics or advices. First one is to have a non-controversial dialogue, and this is what you're planning. I think this is really good. Step outside the negotiations where it can get quite heated. Second is think about the governance. I think you are envisioning co-chair countries. We also have the experience that bringing in more countries in a steering group is quite good to actually create ownership and have a diverse range of views. Third point is a secretariat, because you need someone to do the technical work that probably you cannot do all alone. And then also you have, if you have a reliable secretariat that has a good reputation for giving neutral input, then this also adds value to the document that you are discussing. And we, as I said, with the OECD and IEA, we are quite happy with the input that we get there. Elliot, you said Brazil could serve as a neutral convener. I would slightly disagree, because I think no country is a neutral convener. We all have vested interests. So we can be bridge builders, and we are trying to build bridge builders. I think Brazil has also a good reputation of being a bridge builder, but we will never be completely neutral. Then balance the workload, because I think you have to prioritize in a way, because the members, the countries that you want to invite, they have scarce resources, and if you try to do everything at a time, they will just, then the boat will sink. So this is also, I think these were the 6 ones. And I used the opportunity, completely off topic, but I think, Dave, you said that there was a remark on the German energy transition today at the UN, and I wanted to say that it was factually incorrect. We continue our green transition in Germany, and our climate targets are still the same. 2045 we will be climate neutral, so no change at all in these policies.
Thank you. You heard it here, setting the record straight. So that brings us to a close. I would like to thank our panelists. It was a really rich discussion. Is our closing speaker here? Oh, terrific. Excellent. So we are going to round out this event with remarks from another distinguished public servant, Vice Minister Philip Gall.
Thank you very much, colleagues. My sincere thanks to our moderators and to all speakers for the very rich discussions, as it was mentioned, that we had today. I also want to extend gratitude to the University of Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy for co-organizing this conversation with us. In the meeting today, we tried to explore proof of concept for the new kind of dialogue that Brazil is putting forward with the Integrated Forum on Climate Change and Trade. There was a shared conviction in the value of collaboration, whether it's creating common understanding on carbon accounting, defining what makes a specific good or services have value for climate and sustainable development efforts, or working together to ensure that climate trade measures are fair and effective. Of course, there were divergences in approach. We had representatives from developed and developing countries and international organizations, but these differences were overshadowed by the commonality of our goals. We're all aiming for an effective and just response to climate change, one that ensures our economies can grow and our societies can become more prosperous and more equal. This is why today's dialogue leaves us certain of the value of the integrated forum. Diversity, when harnessed by a shared purpose, is a powerful tool for innovation to ensure that we can generate solutions that are workable, inclusive, and effective, precisely because they carry the imprint of our different national realities, approaches, and perspectives. This brings me to an important point. The challenges at the nexus of climate and trade do not fit into a single policy domain. When climate experts design measures without understanding their impact on global supply chains, we risk creating measures that are ineffective or generate unintended spillovers. When trade experts design policy without an understanding of climate science, we risk creating rules that penalize climate leaders or enable greenwashing. Concrete action happens at the intersection of these fields. Therefore, our solutions must be born there as well. Our goal should be to unite our expertise to build what the private sector calls investment-grade policy. These are policies that are technically sound, commercially viable, and politically feasible, the kind of clear signals that mobilize capital and accelerate the transition we need. This is how we move beyond rhetoric and deliver tangible triple-win approaches that benefit the climate, economic development, and social inclusion. This is what a deep reform of multilateralism looks like in practice. It's not about abandoning the institutions that have served us for decades. It's about making them stronger. It means creating platforms that complement and support the essential works of the WTO and the UNFCCC. It also means applying the lessons from this model to the broader systemic updates our multilateral institutions require. We must have the courage to rethink these institutions to ensure they are fit for the challenges and opportunities that have emerged since their inception. And on this, I would like to complement two ideas here. First, this notion of complementing, especially what the WTO is now. We all know that it needs serious reform. We are speaking in Brazil of a refoundation, in fact. And we, as we are working towards the MC14 in March, we would plan to present some ideas also for the reform of the WTO. So these things complement each other. We are establishing a forum, but we also have to deal with the fact that the WTO needs some serious reform. And if we don't do anything, it will simply remain the way it is in big trouble. This is the first point. The second point I would like to stress here, as it was mentioned in the first panel here, is on the role of bilateral and regional agreements to advance this agenda. We can use these agreements very creatively to advance some points, And in fact, we have done something in this respect last week when Brazil and the other Mercosur partners, we signed an agreement with EFTA countries, Switzerland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, putting some elements of clean energy in the commitments there, especially for the commitments in services. So this was something new that we think we could perhaps replicate in other bilateral agreements and even in multilateral settings. So two additional points. To end, I would like to say that in Belém at COP30, we will be launching the forum that we discussed here. Let us take the energy from this room and turn it into the concerted action that the climate urgency needs. Thank you very much.
Just like to thank you all for attending. As Jason noted earlier, we plan to release the preliminary insights from our international dialogue on climate and trade later in this fall, so please keep an eye out for that, and we look forward to sharing additional insights and hopefully even recommendations as we carry the dialogue forward next year. That concludes our program. Thanks to you all again for attending.